Hello there, and welcome to the next installment of our Bible lessons. And today we have one that I really enjoy doing and prepared a little bit on this one, a little bit extra than usual because partly I have so much fun with it. I like telling this one. Now we're still in the book of Daniel, this time in chapter 3. And what we have in Daniel is a lot of good stuff. Um, that's back to back to back. So it's like each chapter you go through, you come up with another story, and it's like, okay, this is really good, and it demonstrates the people who have great faith in God are heard by God, and a lot of times God will intervene in what those people want to do or want to have happen. I'll get right into the story with this one. Okay, we remember from before that Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon. All right, we talked also about his not being a real good guy and all that. In the last story that we had, he had had this dream, and Daniel, through God's help, had been able to tell him what the dream was and tell him what it meant. Now, in that dream, Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed of this great image, apparently a man because it had a head, arms, and legs, and all of that. And he was told that the head of gold represented uh, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Okay, seems to have gone to Nebuchadnezzar's head, though, is apparently that he decided that, wait a second, this gold statue, this gold part of the statue represents me. I must be pretty, pretty important. So he ordered that there be a statue made, an image, and this wasn't even a little one. Um, it's what we call 60 cubits tall. Now, how long is a cubit, you might ask? The thing is, no one knows exactly. We have kind of an idea that's about a foot and a half because a cubit was measured from the king's elbow all the way up to the end of his middle finger. Now, as you will no doubt understand, um, different kings had different size arms. Now, they all came out to about 18 inches. So, what this ends up meaning is that this statue is going to be 90 feet tall. It's also about 9 feet wide. So, that's a pretty big statue. Now, the thing is, it's covered in gold. And Nebuchadnezzar got this idea. Okay, what we're going to do here is make it so that we're going to have all these musical instruments play during certain times of the day. And when you hear that, you bow down and worship toward this statue. Now, the way they had it in those days, a lot of times, some of these kings would say, well, you can worship whoever you want, but you also have to worship whoever I tell you have to worship. And they emphasize that when you hear the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image. Okay, so pretty much any kind of musical instrument they had, you hear it, you're to drop down and worship it. Now, this presented a little bit of problem for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, partly because they didn't worship anybody but God. And they weren't going to bow down to any other gods, especially these false ones. And they weren't going to apologize for it either. Now, interestingly enough, in this story, we don't hear about Daniel, so we don't know if he was someplace else or uh, busy with other matters. As it happens, because he was so important to the king, he could have been away at this time. And this didn't seem to take a real long time for everything to happen because once this image is up, now you'd think it would take a long time, but maybe not. But let's see what happens with all of this. Okay, you might also remember that with Daniel being promoted last time, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also got promoted. There would have been a lot of people who wouldn't like that because they would think these guys jumped ahead. They got something that they haven't earned and they haven't been here that long, and people get jealous. So some of these guys started watching them and saying, okay, we've got to find some way to get these guys in trouble. Well, they found out pretty quick that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not about to bow to this image and worship it. Why is that a problem for these guys? Well, because if you decide not to do this, if you're going to disobey the king's rules, they had this furnace. Um, think of just a big pit of fire and, okay, unpleasant, especially if you get thrown into it and your house gets torn down. Of course, I think if you get thrown into the fire, you don't really care about the house, and that's not your primary concern. But that was one of those things they like to tag on to some of these punishments that they had. So these people went to Nebuchadnezzar and said, now, didn't you make this rule that people were supposed to bow down to this image and worship it when they heard this music? Nebuchadnezzar says, of course I did. And they said, well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not doing it. King was furious. He heard that. Of course, that shows you a little bit about him, is because when he only hears one side of the story, he goes ahead and gets angry about it instead of trying to figure out whether there is cause for anger or not. That's something a lot of people today have a problem with. So this is nothing new. It goes back to these days. Well, he calls in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, apparently, he's had a chance to calm down a little bit because he's decided now to ask them. And he says, okay, I've heard it said that you didn't bow down and worship the image like I ordered everybody to do. Well, when the music plays, if you bow down and worship, fine. I'm not going to pay attention to what has been said before. But if you don't, if you refuse to worship this image, you'll be thrown into the furnace and burned up. And what God will save you? Well, that's a direct challenge to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their God. And these guys know it. And they say, King, we don't need to defend ourselves in this matter. You can make rules like this if you want, but we're not going to bow down and worship anyone except our God, even if you throw us into the furnace. Oh, by the way, our God can save us, and He will. But even if He doesn't, we're never going to follow what you said. Okay, now Nebuchadnezzar back to being angry. And he thinks he has a good reason. In fact, he is so angry, he says, all right, gives the orders, men, you turn up the furnace, get it burning 7 times hotter than usual. Now, a lot of people think, okay, so if it was 200 degrees, that would be 1400 degrees. It didn't exactly work that way. It probably was not possible for them to get the furnace that much hotter. They could get it hot enough, and like it was even, to somebody thrown into it, it probably isn't going to change the amount of time that it causes the person problems, because when you're thrown into a furnace, you're thrown into a furnace, so it's pretty bad stuff. But when he said 7 times hotter, that was a way they had back then of saying, make it as hot as you can. So they probably used a method where they could pump extra air into the fire and get it to burn the fuel that they were using, probably wood, and make it burn faster, which would generate more heat and make it hotter. And then he had some of his, what they would call mighty men. These are tough soldiers, some of the best he had. He said, tie them up, bind them, and then throw them into the furnace. So they put the ropes on them. They dragged them up to the furnace, and those soldiers threw them in. In fact, because the furnace had been heated up that much hotter, the men who threw them in died from the heat. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall in there. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had been sitting there watching all of this going on, and he suddenly jumps up and he goes, there are men walking around in the fire. He said, wait, weren't there just 3 of them we threw in there? And I go, yeah. He said, I see 4 in there. And the 4th one looks like a son of the gods. Now, what he meant by that, he didn't know about the real God. He didn't know about angels. He knew a little bit about the real God. I'll take that back because of his encounter with Daniel, but he didn't know how things worked. And he was looking in there, and he could recognize, even not knowing about angels and all that, he said, there's something different about this. This is not a mere person who is in there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're walking around in there. So apparently, the ropes that were binding the 3 men had burned up, but the men were okay. Well, he can't go in there, so he calls them out. You come out of here. You come out of there and let me look at you. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been thrown in wearing their robes and the head dresses and whatever else that they had. They came out of there. They weren't burned. Their clothing wasn't burned. They sniffed them. They didn't even smell of smoke. And they said not even one hair had been burned. And you go, how do you know not even one hair had been burned? Well, I want you to try something one day. You'll need your parents to help you with this. But go outside. This has to be done outside. You have a candle, and you light the candle. Then you take one hair, and you put that hair into the flame. And if you smell the smoke coming off of one hair, that will be one of the worst stinks that you'll ever have. It's kind of gross, really, and makes you a little bit sick to smell it. But one hair would do that. If something had burned from them, one hair, they would have known it because they would have smelled like it. And if you've been camping and been around a campfire, how your clothes will smell like smoke, even though you haven't been in the fire. Same thing. Their clothes were not smelling like smoke. So we know from this, they had not been harmed at all. And the only way that could have happened could have been from God's intervention. And obviously, one of his angels had gone in. After that, Nebuchadnezzar had another lesson in humility on that one, same as he had done with Daniel. And he put out this order. He goes, okay, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can save like no other God can. And whatever you do, he makes this decree to all the people. They don't have to bow down to the image. Their God is real and he can save. So that ends up leading to these 3 men being promoted. They had already been moved up once. Not sure what positions they got now because there would have been plenty of jobs in there. It's not named in the Bible. It doesn't matter. Anyone who had come through that and that demonstration of God's power being in there would have impressed the king, obviously. And so these are people he wants to be on the good side of, meaning he doesn't want them upset and angry because he sees that if this God wants to intervene again, he could be in big trouble. So with that, that's the end of the story. Couple of things about that I want to bring up. One is that sometimes you'll be put in difficult situations and you'll have to determine whether to do the right thing or to do what somebody might be trying to get you to do. Um, Best thing is to stick with what you know to be right. Second thing, a little bit more fun on this. I have a tie today, and this one's a new one, and it's a flame tie. And I thought, what better tie to wear for this story than this tie? So I hope you've enjoyed the story, and I hope you'll be back for the next one. Hope to see you then. Bye.